Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
And thank you, John, for joining me. It's really nice to meet you virtually.
You too. Absolutely, Ryan. It's good to connect.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed following your work and diving into some of the stuff you've been doing. And I can just tell we have a lot to explore together. And I really appreciate your podcast. I myself have spoken with James Hollis, which was an honor. And
I saw that. Yes.
Yeah, I loved listening to you speak with him. It was one of my favorite podcasts with him and Richard Rohr, someone who I've followed over the years. I think he's so funny, and you really drew out some of his humor. And I just love what you're doing out there. And I really thought it would be so great to just have you on and explore how you got to be who you are, what you're doing in the world, and share it with others and learn from you in real time. So here we are.
You know, I usually get to hide behind my microphone, and now there's a shift. I enjoy it. And really, Ryan, you're naming some of the most influential people in my life. I've been blessed by, James Hollis was the first professor in my doctoral program. And he was my first class when we read through Jung's volume number 5, Symbols and Transformation. And he was on my dissertation committee. And of course, through the podcast, I've been able to interview him, I think, 3 times now. And for Rohr, he's a spiritual father figure to me. I mean, I appreciate these men and love these men. Rohr and I have an ongoing and enduring relationship that's pretty beautiful. And so you're speaking about people who are not only relationally close, but of course, just the intrapsychic influence that these figures have had. Read all the, most of their books. Rohr's hard to read all his books. He's got 42 books, as Oprah just revealed on her show. Hollis is not all that far. He's got like 28 books or something like that, but such reach, So thank you. Thanks for checking them out.
Absolutely. And sometimes with people that have never been exposed to some of this type of material, someone like James Hollis or reading Carl Jung's work, it's so hard to digest if you're being exposed to it for the first time. And I feel like you do a nice job helping those men pull it out in a more practical, useful, human way. And for me personally, and I'm sure we're going to get into your journey, but when I started floating in these float tanks 15 years ago, I hadn't read Jung and I hadn't stumbled into depth psychology. So I became quickly curious, like, what am I experiencing here? Because I was having these experiences that, say, Jung would speak so clearly about. And it led me down these avenues of reverse engineering subjective experiences. And I think the depth psychology and Jung's work and Hollis's work and Richard Rohr's work, these folks that you have been learning from and you do it yourself, it's so important. Like, there has to be some maps and there has to be some elderhood involved. And that's what I really appreciate about you, is that you've had a practice for like 17 years, right?
Yeah. Practicing as a psychotherapist for 17 years. Yes.
It's amazing. And, so maybe you could just start sharing what you're doing now and then we'll dive backwards.
Yeah. What a gift. It's funny, I like, the personal is interestingly challenging, like so often I'm in the depths of this material, and it really is beautiful to be stepping out in this way to look and reflect on the personal, because of course the material we study in this arena certainly is so interwoven with the personal. And Nietzsche said something that he said, I'll mess up this, I'll paraphrase. He said, be really mindful of anybody who's offering a philosophy, because really what you're getting is the philosopher revealing their own bias, their own heart. And so all these systems are essentially articulating elements of a deeply personal orientation in the cloak of a pretty academic format. And what's been radical, just as a side note, that I've seen for a while now, is that so many of the academic folks that I talk to, certainly in the study of religion, they are very much practitioners and can't be so in the academic world, because there's that bias. But we've all got it, and we all have that kind of identity as a starting point. And something Ram Dass said a long time ago that comes to mind is that you have to have a zip code before you leave it. And so there is a kind of cornerstone, and as you said really beautifully, maps. And I use that image in the book I'm writing a lot. That there's a kind of we're all map makers, and of course the maps that we project out onto the world are in large part based upon our development, our early history, our culture. All these adaptations that we've come to consciously and unconsciously take in, and then imagine that is reality. And of course, it can be pretty destabilizing when we learn that that's not reality. And one worldview shatters, and then a new one starts to take its place. So I think that I kind of went off there, and I even forgot your question. Like you just want me to start with a personal?
Oh, it's beautiful. And I was just going to have you sort of describe what your current work is and what you're doing in the world, because there's a lot there with your podcast and your
Thank you.
therapy
So,
and everything.
So currently, I am my wife and I consider my wife to be one of the most important teachers of my life. We are co-collaborators and co-owners of a wellness center in Houston called the Center for Healing Arts and Sciences, and this is it's really a wellness collaborative where we have a number of different orientations and services that are offering for wellness and health. And my wife, Leela Scott Price is her name. And she says something so beautiful, which is, if you don't need an ambulance, you come here. And I think we're really working in a reactive, pathology-based medical and psychological system. And what we're really trying to do is to bring the spiritual element back into the biopsychosocial spiritual model. And when I was in psychology, I was learning about the biopsychosocial model, because psychology has really renounced its deeply spiritual roots and reality, which I think is revelatory in a lot of ways. But this place that we're doing, we offer up many different services. We have some Jungian analysts that are here. We have a number of psychotherapists from all different traditions, psychodynamic, social workers, professional counselors. We have yoga therapy, we have acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine, herbs, nutrition, human design. We have art therapy, we have group therapy, on and on and on. I do a drum meditation every Monday night, where I play the flute. I use silence and meditation. We do sound healing, and there's breath work. I know that's one of your areas of a transformational practice that you have. And so we have this, what we consider to be a sanctuary, where people come to answer questions about the ways in which they suffer. And so you might find a parenting workshop or a gender equity workshop where we're working at the split between men and women and the masculine and feminine that my wife is a facilitator of. Then we have, on and on. It's really it's an exceptional team of people. It's an exceptional opportunity for people to come together and do this work, the deep inner work. I think just kind of expanding on that, like I'm also the chair of the president of the board at the Jung Center here in Houston, where Jim Hollis used to be the executive director. That's where I first did my doctoral work. I am currently writing a book on, I use the word map often in the book, which I think in the book I'm articulating what I feel like people have either not received or misunderstood about a spiritual worldview. And because I think there are so many misunderstandings of theology and psychology and spirituality. Then I also host a number of groups that are online, in person. These are bringing people together to understand that are what in my tradition of psychotherapy is oftentimes pathologized, suffering in the various ways. I reframe it as an initiating experience. And so I'm working to bring people together and to get a little deeper underneath what our culture has tended to dismiss or fix or solve. Whereas most of our, whether it's shame or anxiety or grief, most of those experiences are initiating us into a broader, more expansive way of existing in the world, where we are, again, not playing out those early formations of what we perceive reality to be, but meeting reality on reality's terms. Something Richard just said in an interview that I did with him. He said, the first Bible is nature. And I think another way of saying that is that the first Bible is reality, and it's this kind of, wide, expansive landscape that we call reality. So I think that I'm sure there are other things, because I have a real insatiable desire to explore, and I've got a real curious nature. So most of it fundamentally is about looking at the ways in which we suffer and how our shadows are oftentimes a repository of the most golden possibilities that we can incarnate in this gift of existence that we've all been given. How's that
I
for
love it, man. There's so much in that we're going to be able to unpack. And I'd love to start first with going into how you even got so where you are today, because this is a big trajectory, and to stumble upon where you and your wife have developed this big, robust system that's all of those things that you just said, which is not the norm in our culture. I can't wait to hear how you got there, but God, what an important work you guys are doing, because it's so rare now, I think, to find that. And for most people, I had a guy text me the other day who comes to breath work, and he just said, man, I'm suffering, and he's off the truck now because he can't do the job, and he's going through a lot. Right. And it's like, where can I go? What do you have for tools? From people are seeking, and they want to feel good. And there is a lot of suffering in our culture, and there always has been through human history, but there's so much I want to hear about. First of all, how you got to this, and probably your own suffering. And then we'll start to dive into why you created the system that you created, because it is so important. And my God, if you were in my hometown, I'd love to come and commune with you guys. It just sounds amazing.
You would be so welcome, and you fit right in, honestly, Ryan.
Cool.
So how I got here, you already nailed it. I mean, through suffering. And the way I define suffering is a little poetic. So it pardon me for this. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, right, the inevitability of suffering is obvious. Whether you study Buddhism and learn that one of the most fundamental teachings of Buddhism is called the Four Noble Truths. And of course, in that paradigm, you have that there is suffering. There's a cause, there's a reason why we suffer. There's a way out of suffering, and the way out is what they call the Eightfold Path. And so they really lead out saying that we suffer because we cling to kind of escapist states of pleasure, and we avoid discomfort. And I frame that a little differently, in that, very similar, of course, but just a little differently, in that I think what we call suffering is really our resistance to meeting reality on reality's terms. And so we want to, of course, say, no, not that, or I deny this, or I don't want to look at that. And what happens is that energy stagnates, and it turns into what Jung called complexes. And so complexes are these bundles of energy that possess us and take us over, and are in large part related to the ways in which we suffer. So I always say this. I mean, I've been studying psychology and spirituality for 20 years. I've got a bachelor's in psychology, a master's in clinical psychology, a doctorate in psychology with a specialization in Jungian studies. I have now been hosting a podcast for 7 years where I'm talking to some of the leading thinkers in these subjects. I have for 17 years worked knee to knee with people through their greatest suffering. And I think that one of the harshest realities that I think that we can encounter is that none of that exempts me or any of us from the inevitability of suffering. So to know the map is not the same as being in the territory. So your question here, how did I start doing this? I mean, I started off as a musician. I mean, I saw the film Back to the Future when I was like a very young person, and I immediately wanted to play guitar. And so it gave me a container for that artist to emerge. And I went through school, and I was never very good at school. I didn't get it. My teachers didn't get me. I kind of went the route of the clown or entertainer, and I was, from theater to music to, all those various areas. I also played a lot of sports growing up, but I realized as I started to age, that was not necessarily the direction I wanted to go. So music was my calling. And by the time I was around, 19 years old, I was actively engaging in it. So 19, things started to cook. 20, I was playing maybe 3-4 nights a week and really expanding my network. I put out an album when I was 21, and then signed a record deal at 23 or 24, and went on tour. We were on a nationwide tour, um, and then something happened that destabilized all of it. And not going too far into the depths here, but essentially, I had the beautiful gift of a son, and and the dynamic with there was a dynamic that split that, and deeply long story short, I ended up for a number of years raising my son on my own. And that was, I had help from family and all kinds of wonderful people and friends that were, I couldn't have done it on my own, but I was certainly at the time felt like I was really solo in this experience. And there's nothing quite like caring deeply for another human being that will mature you in ways that one never thought possible. And so here I was in this state of identity confusion where I thought I was going to be a musician. And frankly, I was on that path. Things were going very well. And then it just shattered. And I didn't know who I was or what I was doing or where I was heading. And not to mention, I was experiencing just an enormous amount of trauma that was happening related to this issues, many that I can't even really articulate, just because it was so destabilizing. And but through that, I found something in myself on a therapist's couch, frankly. I had an incredible therapist at this time, and she supported me in ways that I never thought possible. I started learning meditation, and I started a pretty devoted spiritual practice. I ended up connecting with a number of Buddhist practitioners, and I just became obsessed with Buddhism. And it provided a map, a structure. And I was reading Buddhism there's a lot of lists in Buddhism. Mm-hmm. There's it's exceptional. I was like, these guys, they know what to call these things. They have all these categories and names. And one of the things I did with my therapist is I was analyzing what I wanted to do. And I said to her, I really like what you do. And we kind of talked about my going back to school. And I did, and basically discovered that when I am passionate, I can do a lot that I never realized I could. And so school, in fact, turned into something that, like learning, I think, turned into something that I was very much passionate about. And so, over those years, I went back to school, got my second bachelor's, did my graduate training. All the while I was researching Buddhism and meditation for addiction in particular. So that gave me a real foundational understanding of, I think, spirituality as a practice, not as a concept, but a real practitioner-based model of spirituality. And psychology was giving me a container for how we navigate suffering, and certainly how to connect with other people through their suffering. So I went through, and I started. I enjoy people talking about their exposure to Jung, because I started a doctorate in Jungian psychology having never read any Jung. And I think that's one of those truths that is almost just comical. Who does that, So the first time I was in my class with Jim Hollis and I read Symbols of Transformation, I called my friend Sean Fitzpatrick, who's now the executive director of the Jung Center. I said, I've made a terrible mistake. I don't understand a word this guy's saying. Like he's including Greek and Latin, and I did not learn. I did not go to these classes. I don't know what the fuck is happening, and like I am so confused. And he just said, "Hang in there."
Mm.
And I can only say that I was following a daimon. You know, I was. It certainly wasn't rational. It certainly made no sense for me to invest 6 and 7 years learning this kind of Jungian psychology, but it proved to be the right move. And I became obsessed, and so after my experience in the doctorate, I realized very quickly that I didn't want it to stop, and so my answer for that was the podcast, and that's when I started to say, okay, I can continue doing this, and the podcast really was an opportunity to both continue learning, but also show people a process of a practitioner, you know, a practitioner's process. And it's humble, and it's there's a lot of not knowing. And I that really turns me on, because I think that we project this kind of idealized image onto these figures that even like Hollis and Rohr, you know, that we forget the humanness of the process. And so I wanted to kind of stumble around and ask definitions and not know the answer, and show that as a process. And of course, through the process, Leela Scott and I started the center, you know, in 2014. We've been doing it now for 11 years. Wow. And it has grown and expanded how I show up in the world. And I certainly walk that path of what Jung called the wounded healer, as I think many people who are called to this do.
Amazing.
Yeah, that feels
it's a good place to begin, because when you were first talking to your therapist and you sat in the chair and you had that experience that was so powerful, was she seems like she came from that Buddhist background, or what were the things that she was helping you engage with?
Well, frankly, in the music world, I was as wild as it gets. I was excessive and Dionysian in every step of the way. A lot of kindness, but an enormous amount of wildness.
And did you have a background of religion before that? Or
no,
what was your pre...
Good question. I was socially religious growing up. I mean,
Yep.
I like my religion was, you know, donuts and hanging out with girls, you know, like, so we went to whatever. I was a Methodist. I had great community. But knowing what I know now about the depths of religion and spirituality, it was not that. There was not an ounce of contemplation in my religious formation. And even not a real, I mean, you just kind of learned the stories because that's what people were doing and teaching. But it really, you're like, okay, I got to learn those things, but I'm really here for the people, you know? And in a lot of ways, we all are, you know, like time and time again, the answer is community, deep, intimate relationship. You know, I can even talk about that as a therapist, that the change agent of therapy is not your technique. It's who you are, your relationship, your capacity to be intimate with people. So what happened was I came into session at probably 2:00 in the middle of the day, having already started my day at one of my favorite restaurants in the world called Joe T. Garcia's in Fort Worth, Texas. And I was probably 3 or 4 margaritas into my day. And I was having a blast, and I loved Charlene, my therapist. I love her still. Like, she is was and is an incredibly influential person in my life. And so here I was, just showing up for therapy, like, let's do therapy, you know? And she started to look at me and say, well, you know, John, have you been drinking today? And I was like, oh yeah. Yeah, we started early. This is a fun day. I've had, 6 or 7 people we met at Joe T's. This is great. We had a blast. This is so much fun. I love this. I'm going back after this thing, you know, hell yeah. And she's like, John, you're in the middle going through some custody work with your son. Like you're showing up to therapy having like drunk basically. And I literally was like, well, yeah. What, what do you mean? I'm a, wild musician. Like, doesn't this make sense?
Mm.
And so she challenged me. And I've not been challenged in this loving way. I've not been challenged in a way by somebody that I loved and respected and adored so much, and she said, hey, I think you need to analyze this. And I think you need to take a step back. And I said, well, what would that look like? And she said, I think you need to consider taking a 90-day abstinence process, like to cut it all off.
Mm.
And I think I was feisty enough where I just said, I'll take that challenge. And during that time, I was working with a monk, and I also connected with a number of nuns. There was a Vietnamese monastery about 30 minutes from where I lived, and I would go out there and do Dharma talks. And I had a small community of people, this little sangha that I connected with. And so I did in a lot of ways what AA can tend to do for people, which is substitute a spiritual life for what I think you're yearning and you're longing for in the first place. And so I did a 90-day fast, essentially, from all intoxicants. And on the 90th day, I walked into her office and I said, I like this too much. And so 90 days turned into 5 years. And during those 5 years, I was devoted to yoga and meditation and studies and essentially raising my son until my wife came along when he was about 4 years old. And so I had that transitional period of time to probably become a man that my wife would actually want to marry. Because I don't know if I was that guy beforehand. I was always a considerate, loving person, but I just had some immaturity that I needed to tend to. So in that space, what cracked open is probably an issue with everything from self-worth to a sense of adequacy to capability to self-esteem to the ability to move through my emotional states, to actually have a contemplative practice and have a community in which I was a practitioner, and to get deeply connected with my community in the psychology department at TCU, which was another highly influential space for me. Incredible program, absolutely incredible. And I met so many incredible mentors there and people who have left indelible marks on how I show up in the world, that I'm inseparable from many of these people in my expression now. In particular, a woman named Karen Purvis, who was a leader in the world of adoption and foster care. And so I started working very early on in childhood trauma. And then I spent my professional world working in adolescent inpatient and various group practices. I tutored children who had learning differences with a community here in Houston. I've worked in home with a number of people certainly people that have children that come from trauma, usually in foster and adoption care. And then I would kind of connect with people and teach them how to respond without reactivity to children who'd been really wounded during foundational years of their life. So that therapy experience, I think, was one of the real kind of moments of my life where I discovered a person inside of me that I had never really had access to before that moment.
That's amazing. And I love that she approached it without judgment, but just gave you a mirror and gave you that permission to show up drunk, but to just call you out in a nice way, which is awesome because not a lot of people know how to do that in a way that's got the compassion and the integrity behind it. It's usually judgmental or shame and all the other stuff. But there was something in that. I think there's a thread here that I would love to just ask you about, because you've also studied some of the issues, like you said, with what you were missing from the way you grew up religious in a way, but it was more social, which is the most common thing that I even grew up with. Yeah. And basically, what do you think happens when people are indoctrinated or born into, say, whatever religious programming they get, but it's not really embodied and they don't really have a true understanding of their spiritual roots, which to me, I grew up a basic Christian. We go to church on Sundays, and then through the week, I would just basically have this prayer at night where I begged for things and asked for forgiveness. And then I'd go back to being
Yeah.
silly and not
Yeah.
thinking about anything. It was disembodied. And I didn't start thinking about any of that until I got in my early 20s either. And I don't want to go into my story too much, but what do you think that underlying thread is for the spiritual component that you think is tied into all of this that's missing?
Great question. And basically, you've set up the entire reason why I'm writing the book that I'm writing.
Awesome.
Because I feel that, the book is really I started to look at the process. I imagined an 18-month long, very healthy, transformational psychotherapeutic process. And I broke that down into 10 stages because I'm really interested in AA and the model of spirituality in AA. I think it's one of the best models that we have for like a real, genuine spiritual process that, of course, is born deeply out of suffering. And essentially what it says is, hey, the gods you worship, which means the orientation that you have to reality currently is no longer tenable. And you currently have no way of getting out of that because you're caught in what Freud called a repetition compulsion, like a little eddy in the river. And this is your whirlpool that you're sucked in all the time. And we need to create a different version of the gods you worship, or find new gods for you to worship. And so we turn it over to a higher power. And that doesn't have to be some entity. It can be nature. It can be a value system. It can be a professional life. For me, it was fathering. Fathering was the first time I'd ever really looked outside of my own ego and found something powerful. And so I think those are some of the structures that exist that kind of redistribute or shatter one worldview, and then we have to have another that emerges. So I think I'll use a big word here. It's hermeneutics, I think, is what is largely missing in terms of our modern religious formation, because we are orthodox based in that we assert a kind of belief system, certainly in the West. But I want to blow this up. I mean, it's not just about religions. It's about what we do as humans, right? Like back to that idea that I said earlier, in my early formation of my reality, my development, I have certain assumptions, expectations, and agreements with who I am and what the world is and how I operate within it. And so eventually we need to realize that that's not, those powers that you worship, those gods you worship, aren't the gods of mystery, the gods of transcendence. They're the gods of typically survival, the gods of particular social systems, the gods of your own identity. And essentially religion reifies that by saying, you need to approach the greatest mysteries of our existence with the belief system that you can ask that mystery to meet your needs as you believe they need to be met. So it's an ego-based orientation. When I say, God, fix this or do that, yet we all know on some level suffering and the shattering of a worldview is what really is the root system of our most powerful transformations in our existence. And I just know that because I talk to people all day long and I get to see behind the curtain, and so those ideas and assumptions are somewhat colluded with in a lot of the models of religion that we currently have. And so it says, yes, that's right. Like you need to ask for, God to give you a parking place and to make you, not be this or make you more wealthy or whatever your ego imagines it needs in order to eradicate, fix, or transcend any suffering. And I think that what we miss out on is the capacity to penetrate deeply into your suffering. To be of, and I like this shift where we say, not God, what can you do for me? but to the gods, what can I do for you?
Mm-hmm. An
So I
offering.
prefer a kind of servant theology where we are in participation. We are participating in the movement of the nature of reality, as opposed to imagining that our particular ego needs are greater than or more knowledgeable or more insightful than the wisdom of utter and complete destabilization that will set your psyche up to become fertile ground for new developments that you could never have imagined to emerge. I
Mm,
never, ever, ever thought about becoming a therapist.
that's
Ever.
awesome. Yeah.
You know? And so I think that the hermeneutic piece is that we didn't learn how to interpret dynamics of these mysteries.
Mm,
We never learned how to understand the nature of our own egos. And that's one of the reasons why I think depth psychology offers so much, is that it actually gives us a map of how to interact with these mysterious energies that are universal, and yet also very particular, in that you, Ryan, have different dynamics than I would, but the dynamics themselves, like the riverbed,
mm-hmm.
the riverbeds are in us both, but the content of the river will be different.
Oh, I love it.
That,
Yeah. And it's
that
so opposite of what we've been, like you said, fed and taught. And I really love that because in my little journey so far, which I still feel like a very much a beginner, but I've been learning a lot about the word reciprocity from the elders that I've found as the base of existence to this relationship to what you would
yeah.
call the gods or spirit or
Mhm.
something higher than you. And for me, it came from a friend, Don Howard, who spent lots of years working with plant medicines down in the jungle, but also just knew a lot about heart centered consciousness and
Yeah.
not only knew it, but embodied it. And I got to see what happened after someone who was suicidal in his 40s. I got to see him at 72 after cultivating and working out his own stuff, but also being of service. And he embodied presence, reciprocity, service in a way that I've never seen someone do that for the first time, like a real elder.
Hmm.
And I remember I went down to the jungle in 2018 with this mindset, like you just said, that we're all taught to, what can I want to heal. I want to
Yeah.
experience, blah, blah, blah. I had
Gimme,
my
gimme,
list of
gimme.
intentions. Give me, give me, give me. I was still playing that game. And the first day he said, you can throw everything away, all those lists, everything. And he
Mm.
said to make an offering. What
Ah,
are you? The offering was like the shift of, whoa, this list was all bullshit,
yeah.
and everything I thought that I was going there for was all gone. And I remember showing up because this changed my life actually, just that little shift, and it's been working better ever since. Because now I flipped from what can I get to how lucky am I to even be able to go there, to have the money, the time, the energy to fly in a jet down to another culture. Like, what a luxury. And not many people through human history got to have that experience. And
Right.
then it made me more in curiosity, awe, wonder. And so I showed up with more just like how grateful I was to even be a part of the experience. And I
Yeah.
wanted absolutely nothing. And I was also then receiving whatever was going to come through to then hopefully be of service to whatever it was that was going to be showing and revealing itself to me.
Mm.
And anyway, I wanted to make it personal because I think everybody is going through this all the time over and over again. And it's like at the base of my spiritual relationship now is, first of all, I'm having an experience. So thank you, God, universe.
Mhm.
Thank you. Gratitude should be the first prayer. Not there is no shoulds, but I sure put that in as first priority number one because I don't know enough about the nature and the complexity of it to start wanting anything. I should first take account for what is, which is that I'm here and I'm
Yeah.
not separate from it. And I think that what you're talking about stems from that. And then the AA programs and everything. I'd love to ask you. Well, let's hit on this first, but I want to ask you a little bit about the AA issues with some of the, just like religion, there can be issues in the way the program develops or the people that lead certain
Yeah.
programs, because I've seen some beautiful friends go through it and it changed their life and they still think, thank God it exists, but they also found that they were abandoned when they decided to go, say, use a plant medicine
Oh,
for
sure.
healing. because
Yeah.
they were no longer considered sober. So I don't want to miss that piece, but let's start with the reciprocity, gratitude, and relationship piece, if you don't mind.
So the one thing I wanted to note there, thank you for that, by the way. That's a beautiful shift, and I hope everybody can experience something like what you've just talked about. Um, I find that it does that one's connection to nature and having a kind of again back to that the first Bible you need to read is the Bible of nature, and you don't actually need to read anything. You can observe. I've had some of the more powerful mystical experiences of my life contemplating an ant pile,
Yeah.
or a weed growing out of the concrete. Like those are some I would consider to be some more meaningful religious experiences than anything I ever had in a church.
Yeah.
And so you said gratitude earlier, and I wanted to also just compliment what you're saying with gratitude. And I don't know whether it's chicken or the egg, but to me, it's awe and wonder.
Yeah.
And because the first is a kind of wordless state, which is the experience of awe, and then that moment of gratitude where you're kind of then your consciousness comes on and you're able to give words to it and say like thank you, thank you, thank you, this is amazing. But I really connect with those two words, awe and wonder, as some of the more meaningful quote religious or spiritual orientations that I just imagine you are swimming in this kind of experience that you're describing, and then
Yeah.
that residue stays.
Yeah.
And if I can access that with an ant, I can certainly access it in my moments of suffering. And even yesterday I went into a pretty significant descent into this kind of sense of struggle. I was in the struggle, and the insight happened when I realized, I was like, oh, I'm not participating with awe and any amount of gratitude for just this incredible gift to be awake. And that I feel is part of the meaningful endeavor. Back to AA. I mean, I think that. Sorry, and I just got to follow this thread because I want to get to
Mm-hmm.
what you're talking about. It's not about AA. It's not about Buddhism. It's not about Christianity. It's not about Jainism or Hinduism or Islam. We are fundamentalists, which is another way of saying we all have capacities inevitably to reduce aspects of reality to some kind of rigid structure that is more in service to our own ego.
Yeah.
And the other idea that I think is really important in a spiritual context is the idea of surrender. And in the AA world or in the Christian world, a lot of times you have this anxiety about whatever suffering you're carrying. And the fantasy is that you will go there and do that thing and it will get rid of this thing.
Mm.
And certainly that can happen for a while, but anybody who's gone on that errand knows pretty quickly that it doesn't actually get at what you think it's going to get at. The same thing happens with people who are highly successful and make a great deal of money.
Mm.
And I sit down with successful people all the time and, how's that working for you? Did it do for you what you thought it was going to do for you? And the answer inevitably is, well, some things, but primarily no. And so we project onto money, we project onto AA, we project onto Christianity, we project onto nature. So the thing that I think AA gets really correct is that they take people through a process. I never had a process in Christianity.
Right.
They say, check this box, believe this thing. And if you don't, we get some problems. But they didn't take us through a process. And so where AA, I think, could learn from, part of what I'm trying to articulate in the book I'm writing is that you still need to learn hermeneutics and how to interpret the nature of your reality. And so one thing I teach is way back to early religious studies. Certainly Origen, Dante. I read this letter from Dante when I was doing my dissertation, and he actually tells a nobleman who's basically his patron, and he tells this nobleman that actually, when you read the Inferno, there are several levels to interpret it. And he's teaching a hermeneutic, saying, hey, don't take this thing literally. Because in fact, Dante, a lot of people don't, here's a tangent for you. Dante was incredibly depressed when he lost his name and title in Florence, 700 years ago, whenever that was. And or 600, and went into a depression, and out of him emerged this allegory of descent. And he articulates it, he writes it out. It's a psychotherapeutic orientation. I mean, he's essentially engaging psychodynamics of his inner life and giving them form. And he's got a guide. Virgil's taken him down, and he's hitting all these levels of his own hell and our collective hell. And then he puts it into story form to communicate it, because we always have to narrativize it. We are story creating, story engaging, story living beings. Mm-hmm. And so he puts it into a beautiful story that I have sitting right over there on my altar in this office. And he writes this nobleman the letter that says, hey, don't just take it literally. There are literal aspects to this, but there are also symbolic and moral and psychological aspects. And we've lost that today. We've lost the kind of training that helps us understand that we are a multiplicity of consciousnesses. We're not some unified field of consciousness. There are many parts of me. There are many parts of you. And various parts of ourselves are going to be having different conversations throughout this one conversation. Mm-hmm. You'll be reacting to something that I say and thinking about that and reminded of this thing, and you'll go elsewhere and I'll go elsewhere, and then we'll come back. And so all that's happening all the time. And essentially we are these radical beings that are gifted with this multiplicity of consciousness that are then told that it's one thing. Mm-hmm. So we're shoving that all into one thing. And I think that makes us malleable, and we can be taken advantage of in that way, because we lose a lot of our autonomy and the recognition that God, when I use that word, I don't mean an entity necessarily, right? I mean the kind of deepest whisper inside of us that connects us to the nature of our existence in ways that are beyond our comprehension. And that there are elements to the nature of reality that are simply ineffable, unattainable, unnameable, unimaginable by our human experience. And whatever that is, which I could never know what it is, I can know my relationship with whatever that is. Whatever that is, I stand in reverence to. And that's the only attitude that I can imagine. Mm-hmm. But our early religious formation doesn't really take us through a process of learning those dynamics. And frankly, like Buddhism was that for me, and depth psychology was that for me. And so I think if AA could add a little to their secret sauce, it would be some depth psychology. Because you're going to become dogmatic. If you're unconscious of your dogmatism and you're unconscious of your fundamentalism, it will simply just reattach itself in a different context. And so I will go from a fundamentalist addict into a fundamentalist addict to AA. And that might support me in that it might prevent me from using a substance that's going to kill me. However, I might still be an asshole. I might still, demean other people. I might still disconnect myself from the human pantheon of connection and relationship and intimacy. And I might go the way of Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol, which I think is a deeply potent story about not being in the flow of relationship and intimacy. Okay, I went off there, so you're going to have to.
No, I love it, and I'll go back to the AA thing in a moment, because there's more to get into there, because I think it's a beautiful subject that so many people I know go through the program and it saved their life. But then I've also seen the abandonment and all the other things that then I never knew how powerful it was because I never had dealt with addiction and had to go through it, but I've had lots of family and friends. And so I'm very curious to go into that a little bit more, but I want to go back to what you said about the awe, the wonder, the mystery, and the
Yeah.
letting go piece, because that is the foundation of my my relationship to this experience now, is to remain as those are the key foundations for me that I've had to learn subjectively through experiential things. And just in life, it works better for me to really just be in awe and to be in wonder and to be okay with the unknown and the mystery as the beauty of it. Because even in the scientific communities, I've talked to some of these cool neuroscientists. I've listened to some amazing people who have spent their whole lives studying the subject of consciousness. And at the end of the day, they come back with the same stuff, the core principles of like, we just don't know. And we all have these theories and ideas, but that's to me, what makes it so much more beautiful and interesting. And then the only way to really contend with that is to let go and to lean into it with curiosity and wonder, which leads to an infinite exploration of your own consciousness. Like you said,
Yeah.
when you looked at the anthill, or you can look at clouds, or you can just sit and go inward and look at the complexity of your physiology and the fact that you're breathing. There's an infinite way to
Yes.
blow your own mind, you
Yeah.
know? And
Totally.
so, but we get caught on the self and the ego and the narratives that we've been conditioned to. And so off of the thread of those components of curiosity, awe, wonder, surrender, and then
Yeah.
you said map making, which is what we are. We're little narrative storytellers. The problem I've seen so far is that when I was laying in those tanks is that you have a giant mass amount of just conditioning. And so a
Yeah.
lot of our techniques here are to start to just separate from the identity with these stories, the maps, and to see that they are maps. They're not correct maps. They're just
Right.
maps. And then to see which ones are true and untrue and let go of a lot of maps. Like
Yeah.
really, it's hard to let go of maps because they became our identity. And
Oh,
so to work with the narratives and the conditioning and the idea of the ego, it's not to crush it or kill it. It's just to befriend it, build a relationship with it, and then be curious. I love curiosity. I think it's the
yeah,
the root
absolutely.
medicine for the human condition is to be
Yes.
curious instead of judging it or shaming it, or just lean into it. And that's where you find the weird, ugly stuff. And that's where we learn and grow. So anyway, I wanted to go there, and then we'll go back to the AA thing and see what you had to say about map making, and also just the unimaginable amount of social psycho warfare happening through these tech companies. And people know this now about attention warfare. It's an attention economy. And so
Mhm.
these young people, I mean, even last night I went on some calls, and I've never seen so many young people in their 20s and teens that are suffering from anxiety and just lack of meaning and purpose. And they call the fire department. That's their resort, is to call 911, because they're just overwhelmed and they don't even know where to begin. And I think it's the smartphones and the dopamine hits and all of the addictive nature, but because there's such a market for it,
Yeah.
and so there's just this tidal wave of things that people are contending with that are far beyond, I think, what our ancestors were dealing with. So let's talk a little bit about what I just said and see where you picked up off of that thread, if you
Thank
don't
you.
mind.
Um, I got immediately curious just about your day in, day out in your professional world, and I just went into that. Wow, you see what an interesting and overwhelming, and I'm sure traumatizing experience you have in many ways, given that you're at the epicenter of some of the more horrendous experiences that we can endure. When you go as a responder to those, like, so we can maybe tend to this later, because I certainly want to know how you have learned how to work with that energy.
Mm-hmm.
What comes up. And so I'll plant that seed. So I want to answer your question, but I want to come back to that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the first thing that comes up for me is this idea of what I call sacred refusal, and it goes under the heading of adaptation. And I think you're spot on by talking about maps, in that we are consistently creating maps. I mean, maps of who each other is, maps of expectation, maps of what we're doing, one of my favorite things I learned when I was doing my first bachelor's degree is this one teacher taught us that in any dyad, there are 6 perspectives. There's what you think and what I think, what I think you think and you think I think, and what I think you think I think and you think I think you think. And that's happening simultaneously. And if you just kind of expand that out, you say, whoa, those are a lot of maps that are operating simultaneously, many of them well beneath our conscious awareness. And those little pings and prods and ideas and perceived threats and all the protective dynamics, all of the connective dynamics that are happening, all related to maps that are being created. So I think, back to the thing I was talking about with worldview, this little image came to mind that I tend to teach to, which is if I grow up in a family system where and this was not the case for me, but I'm drawing from a lot of stories that I've connected with, of course. And every time I go to seek out touch with a parent or a caregiver, and because of whatever happened to them, they get rigid, just subtly, then I, as a child, without even words, no words, I learned very quickly, don't do that. Don't try to get love in that way. Don't try to get connection in that way. And so if I'm that child, and this is happening over and over and over again, like the calluses that develop on my hands and feet, and yours too, those calluses are created and about love, value, who I am, who will my needs be met? Is it okay to be intimate? Is it okay to seek physical connection? The answer, by the way, is of course and absolutely. It's necessary. I say a lot of times the worst punishment we can do in many ways in prisons is to isolate people. And yet these kinds of moves of isolation happen in our family systems all the time because this caregiver, in this instance, hardens a little bit, unconscious of the messaging that it sends the child. So then that child grows up totally unaware of these contracts and agreements that were made in their psyche about giving care, receiving care, connecting, expressing, and so on and so forth. And then that plays out all the way into their adulthood. And maybe they're repeating that unaware. So maybe their partner now is seeking care and they're doing the same thing their father did or their mother did or their caregiver did. And so there's a story, there's a narrative that's not based in some massive trauma. It's based in a little trauma, a repetitive, dynamic that will determine on some level. And I want to use that. It can determine, I'll say that better, on some level, how that individual will then interact with intimacy. Okay, that's a map. That's an adaptation. That's not about me. That's about what was done to me, what happened to me in formative years. And I carry those adaptations with me throughout my life because they fundamentally are related to giving care and receiving care and, protection and survival and connection. And so I consider, I call this the sacred refusal because at some point that individual will come up against that map. And they will have the choice of doubling down on that and saying, this is the way life is. And all the while unconnected with how painful that is, given the needs that we have with intimacy. Just that's how we are. Go look at John Bowlby or Harlow's experiments in early childhood attachment. I recommend anybody in the audience to go look at Edward Tronick. Type in YouTube, Ed Tronick, still face, and just look and see what happens to an infant when a parent doesn't offer any kind of feedback. They just go blank. The child freaks out. So we have these inherent needs. And so those maps continue. And at some point in your life, you're going to be challenged, and you will be challenged to say, hey, maybe the ways that I give and receive love are not about love. They're about what happened to me and how I'm continuing this on. And so I consider it a sacred refusal to be the moment where I can refuse the kind of flow of those early attachments and early adaptations, and choose to experience life in a new way and develop and cultivate new ways of getting care and receiving care. And so that's a challenging time because our egos need maps, because I define the ego as the organ of orientation. And so it's saying, hey, this is the world, and I seek out that which is familiar and predictable, which means not good or bad. It means what is what has been done. What's the world that I've grown up in and developed into, and there will therefore be ego discomfort when considering and working through a new map. And my tolerance, my ability to tolerate the death of that worldview, which we usually have to have a higher order, in order to get there. Because, like, for my son, like I had to shatter all my maps because he was a higher order value than living the way that I had been living. So I think that, and what happens is that when you do that and you start to realize, like, oh, again, that's not reality. That was my perception of reality. Then awe comes into play, because then you go, wait a second. What of nature am I not experiencing? Because I've had these kind of limiters on. Our consciousness is an outstanding limiter, and so already, right? But then our environment and our early history are even more of a limiter, and so we've got to expand that. And that's a difficult thing to do, but we have to be punk rockers in it and say, like, I'm fucking done with that old way of being, and I'm gonna risk. I guess my favorite image of this, and I'll pause after this, but is a hermit crab. And the hermit crab eventually has to leave its shell because it's growing. But it's scary, because the moment that hermit crab leaves its shell to find a new one, it's the most dangerous moment. Its protection's gone. And two things happen when the hermit crab moves into its new shell. Number one, it's uncomfortable because it's not quite what the old shell was. And also it now needs to grow into the new space. And so that's a good metaphor, I think, for how we operate. And we need to have loving, present scaffolding to do that, or we're highly traumatized, because in those moments of liminality in between the two shells, things can get pretty bad if you don't have the community. That's why I like the Buddhist Sangha for that. Okay, I'll pause there.
No, I love it. And I love the hermit crab analogy. That's really cool. And then for the practical nature of somatic work, or ways to slow down, like even just one of the things I've learned over the years is that the hardest thing in the West, at least, is we praise momentum, we glorify it, we reward it. So everybody thinks, hey, how are you? I'm busy. That's great. Me too. That means it's like a badge of honor. And, early on in my journey, I realized I was terrified to tell the guys in the morning at the station when they asked me, what are you going to do with your day, that I didn't have an answer. Now I'm actually excited to have a day of serendipity and going with the flow and learning that I can go to the gym and go do all these beautiful things, maybe a hike, and maybe I'm off today. How about I just have a day of being a human being, not a human doing? And that's not looked up. It's like a badge of laziness when you start to think about the way our culture thinks of success. And so with breath work, a lot of the stuff that I've been learning myself for many years, and it's not comfortable, but it gets really comfortable and gets really exciting when you start to slow down, and with the awe and the wonder and the curiosity. But in the beginning phase for people, they come to breath work. The biggest component is the first 15 minutes of slowing down, letting go, slowing down, letting go. How do we feel when we start to do that? Because that's where we contend with all the emotions, all of ourselves. And that's what the float tank was for me. That's what psilocybin was for me on the hill many times. It was always like not fun. for the first 30 minutes sometimes, because that's where you're dealing with the shadow and all the
Yeah.
stuff that you were talking about, the micro traumas, the big stuff, the little stuff, the fact that you're ridiculous sometimes, and that your whole life might be a scam or a sham, I used to call it, and I'm like, this whole thing is a joke. And so to contend with that requires courage. And I always tell people it takes courage to be still and to slow down and to let go. And I think you're hitting on all this stuff a lot in the ways that you teach and from what you're learning. But what are some of the ways practically to start building new maps, seeing maps and letting go in your experience? Because I've gotten into, the body keeps the score and a lot of the somatic work,
Oh
because
yeah.
that's where you have to get that nervous system down and allow those brainwave states to shift to then really be able to peer behind the veil.
Yeah. Yeah. A couple things to say. Thank you. I had this image of I started learning Greek a while back, and I probably learned ancient Greek of a like 3-year-old.
Yeah.
Like I didn't get very far. I got enough, interestingly enough, to like start to pierce through a little bit, but by no means do I mean to imply that I learned Greek. But one of the things that happened to me that my teacher really needed to remind me is okay, here I am, this, capable. I'm like you. I talk to neuroscientists and quantum physicists and computer scientists and religion professors, and I read all this stuff, and I got a doctorate, and I started reading Greek, and I felt like a 3-year-old, and it was uncomfortable, and I felt inadequate, and I felt there was some judgment that came up. Certainly, I think it was uncomfortable. Let's just say that. And I really thought, well, yeah, of course it is, because learning's hard and committing is hard. Committing to something is hard. Committing to a job, committing to a marriage, committing to a friendship, committing to a role as a parent, committing to a professional world, committing to a spiritual practice. And I think there are, like, initiation is supposed to be hard. Once you get through the initiation, your status changes. You're a different person, and you're not going to get there by, pleasant. My my mentor, one of my therapists, another one of my therapists, I've seen a number. He used to quote, this is Muhammad. He would say, "Did you think you would enter into the garden of bliss without having to endure all the trials of those who came before you?"
Wow.
Man. So then I want to kind of add to that a little bit by fusing together a couple of the threads in our conversation, in particular the one on addiction, because we're all addicts, right? Like, we scapegoat substances all the time. This is a shadow dynamic in our culture, and we will let them have it. And oh, those addicted people over there, not me. All right, I'm not addicted to my cell phone, but if I walk out of a gathering and I realize my cell phone's not in my pocket, my body will erupt as if I'm experiencing, some kind of mugging or something. Like, that's a dependency, and you have a physiological dependency. And so I like the addiction framework because I want to challenge all of us to say, where are you addicted? And what's your process? Like, do you have one? Like, busyness is addiction. Materialism is addiction. Productivity is addiction. And the image that came to mind when you were talking was the Matrix, the film The Matrix, when Morpheus says we've become this, and he holds up a D battery. So we are producers, and even in that very misunderstood document of the Old Testament and the book of Genesis, when Adam and Eve have left, and now he says, man must toil the earth and women must endure the pain of childbirth. It's a productive model, a production model. And that sets us down a pretty, we've developed a lot. we have a lot of innovation. I like air conditioning and this computer and our ability to be here, although it's incomplete. And I think that's part of what kind of the spiritual orientation is, to say, yeah, this is wow, yeah, we've had these, this is amazing, and what else? Where is it incomplete? Um, so I went off on that, and you were talking about. I think your question was about proactive, like how to navigate this. Is that correct?
Yeah, and like, what are some of the practical ways for people to restructure their narratives? Is it an embodiment practice as well as a writing practice? What are some of the tools and maps that you help people to create this system?
Yeah.
Because a lot of times people don't know where to begin because they are busy.
Well, I started that on my website. I offer a webinar on it's an hour-long webinar called The Enchantment of Everyday Living. It's what I consider to be the fundamentals. Obviously I'm teaching in an hour, right? I could teach this, 3 months, but in an hour I talk about some of the fundamentals of spiritual practice. And along with that, there's a 21-day challenge, which is essentially a journaling challenge to begin to create symbolic intimacy, symbolic literacy, and inner dialogue, a kind of inner conversation that we can be having, as I said earlier, with that multiplicity of selves and consciousnesses that are inside of us. So I think journaling, I'm a massive advocate, and most people that I talk to journaling about start to distract and look elsewhere. I think journaling is an encounter, and if we don't cultivate the ability to experience discomfort of looking at ourselves, then we will just bypass, right? And I think that's an important concept to bring in here. I think most spiritual and religious traditions in modern times facilitate a spiritual bypass, and that's part of the issue, is that we are, again, asking the gods, asking reality to prevent us from feeling uncomfortable, as opposed to cultivating the capacity to be uncomfortable in service to a higher value, principle, and goal and structure. So if I'm looking for transformation as a value system, then I'm going to feel deeply uncomfortable as I encounter that stage of transitioning, right? The courage in that hermit crab, the courage in that moment. And so number one, I have that program, and certainly I'm in the middle of trying to build a lot of these, I would say, structures that I feel people can benefit from. So yes, I think journaling is important. I think that some kind of embodiment practice is important. When you said you do sensory deprivation and sitting in these tanks, that is what do you get out of that? There's no telling. Go do it for a month, and then journal about it. I think we need an embodiment practice. I personally feel like one of those embodiment practices, not only sensory dep or certainly meditation, right? Meditation is, I think we've done it in our culture. We've turned it into a kind of stress management tool, which is fine. But I would offer up, it's even more important to become an observer of your own inner life. And in order to do that, you have to actually have a practice. So I think a contemplative practice is absolutely important, even if it's 3 minutes of observing what your consciousness is like as soon as you wake up and before you open your eyes. Or I think building an altar is one of the most important spiritual practices you can have. This guy, Robert Johnson, he's a Jungian analyst. He wrote a book, something like Between Heaven and Earth, or I forget the name of it, but he went to India, and he was just looking at the structures of the homes in India versus the structures of the homes here. And he said, they've all got a private place where people commune with the divine, commune with themselves. And when you look at our modern homes here, most people don't have a sacred place where you go. And if you don't have a place, then let me say it this way, you tend to need a place out there, let me point this way, to have a place in here. And so there's an opportunity, as within, so without kind of dance, that we create an altar. And so a contemplative practice, a journaling practice. What I'm getting at basically is in the book what I call the 5 keys and the 5 principles. And if anybody's curious about this, certainly do the webinar. I teach it in an hour and then give you a bunch of practices to start. So frankly, the challenge that I offer is 21 days, about 30 to 40 minutes a day. There's a process to go through. And that's the other thing. I mean, I guess let me back way up and say, let me borrow from Buddhism. Is fundamentally Buddhism at its core offers the 3 jewels as part of the kind of the core dynamics, and they are a teacher, a path, and a community. And so we need to have an elder. You said earlier, I think having an elder or somebody who has been there before, or somebody who's cultivated wisdom in their lives, to be a bit of a guide. And by guide, I don't mean taking you by the hand and running you through the wilderness. I mean bumper bowling, just somebody who's able to go, not like what sponsors do in AA. They say, not that, maybe try this, and then you got to go do it. Yoga certainly is a really powerful practice, but martial arts has been important to me. Like I think there's the Greeks did this in their education a lot, which is actually the embodiment of like pushing up against a physical force that at the end of it doesn't turn into violence, but what it does is it turns into a connection. Like whether it's boxing or jujitsu, I loved the time when I was doing jujitsu, and this guy choked me out so fast and it hurt so bad. And I came out of it, and rather than go be pissed off, we sit down for 5 minutes. I'm like, how'd you do that? Tell me what you did. Let's repractice it. It's like, so there's a confidence that builds and an expansion that grows. And so I go down to the model of the king, warrior, magician, lover, or queen, warrior, magician, lover. And as a kind of quadrant of what we need, and we need to put ourselves in positions of leadership. We need to recognize how to use our sword. We need to recognize how to use the olive branch and create peace. We need to recognize how to create things where there was nothing, and hopefully it's in service to the betterment of all people. So maybe that's not as practical as.
No, I love it, and I can tell that you've put the work in to go to the resources that you've already created to dive deeper, which is great. So there's already a nice, rich destination for someone to really go hammer into some of the most practical elements that you've already put into place.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
a lot of times, even the people I work with, they have lots of different religious backgrounds and things, and I really respect it, because at the end of the day, what matters is who the person is showing up as, what character. Your relationship to whatever your deity is or whatever your beliefs are is not nearly as important to me as like, how are you showing up? And I'm so lucky at my little firehouse to work with 7 other men. And to be honest, they're the most amazing, inspirational men I've ever worked with as far as integrity, the way they treat their wives. They all have wives and kids, the way they're fathering. And they don't have the same beliefs that I do at all. But, at the end of the day, I can trust them with my life. And I think of them a lot where I focus in on them in a deep meditation or whatever. And I think, wow, I can really just see them and hold that and be like, dude, these are some crazy, awesome. Like if you meet one of these people in your life, you're lucky. And I'm living with them every third day. And what a blessing. But not everyone gets to have that, where you're cooking with people and trusting people and knowing people truly. And maybe when we're off, they're so busy with their lives that we can't have that outside of that community. But what do you say about the pitfalls of community? Like, I know there's some pitfalls to it too, because over the years I started seeking immediately when I was like, well, the church ain't working, so I'm going to go find it at yoga, or I'm going to find it at Burning Man, or I'm going to find it somewhere. And then I'd get into the community space, and I realized it was just a bigger problem. Then I realized I'm going to spend time alone in nature. I'm getting away from all this shit. There's amplified stuff going on there.
Yes.
And so what do you say about that for people seeking community in a healthy way?
I say a lot about that. It's so funny you asked this question, because I'm writing I facilitate a number of men's communities, and in part they're like men because, frankly, as a psychotherapist who's a man, I get a lot of referrals for men because there aren't many male psychotherapists. And so over time, I've just become, and also I need to say with my wife's awareness, like her core orientation is looking at the masculine and the feminine. And I think in a number of ways, it was not as obvious to me that I was really moving myself to work with men in this way. So on many occasions, some gentle, some not so gentle, when she's like, hey, dude, don't you see what's happening here? There's an opportunity for you to take this and move into these communities of men. So I'm in that. I'm actually in the process of building communities and larger communities, but also smaller communities of men. 8 is a magic number. And so I currently co-facilitate 4 groups per month. 2 of those groups meet weekly. 2 of those groups meet once a month of men. And I'm writing what I call a cleansing. So the 4th gate of the book that I'm writing is the cleansing. And that's what we were talking about earlier with sacred refusal. It's I have to actually give up, whether it's burn off or let go, these adaptations, and I need a process in order to do that and a ritual around that. So the cleansing is a communication process because when I work with men, and this really goes for everybody, it's just because I tend to work with a lot of men, but it's just any community. I want to set communities up to address 3 core dynamics: your inner life, your outer life, and the life amongst us. And so when we come together as community, we are aware that I have these 3 things happening, and the life amongst us tends to be one of the most difficult because that's where our judgments and resentments and all the shitty parts of our, the belief systems, the aggression, it's resentment and judgment, that if most people were honest, you would see that the stream of consciousness throughout your day-to-day is a lot of resentment. There's a lot of resentment, unless you have a really powerful practice of awareness that you've cultivated. So with that in mind, and with that inevitability in our social spaces, we need systems to help navigate through those areas of tension. And I would argue that most, whether it's churches or synagogues or any holy space, they fundamentally commune around that belief system. What they don't do is say, hey, we're in community and we're going to have conflict. We're going to have differences, and let's create a process right out of the gate. Part of our initiation process is you learning our process to help navigate through the ways in which we're going to touch on each other's complexes and pain. And so we need to set up a structure so that we have that channel to go through, because if we don't, we'll just go back and rely on what we've relied on throughout our whole lives, which would be to collapse or withdraw or be passive aggressive or be directly aggressive. And that, of course, doesn't serve anybody. It doesn't serve my ability to become aware of what I'm constellating in other people. It doesn't do the same for others. And it doesn't give us an opportunity to be in a reparative process. And, I would say that as a therapist, facilitating rupture and repair in group space is one of the most important aspects of the training that I have. Which is to recognize. I was in a group yesterday, actually, and there was one of these guys looked at another one of the guys and was like, "I'm really angry," and he was talking about something else, but the way that the other dude interpreted it was, "I'm really angry at you." And the funny thing about it is, he wasn't pissed; he was excited because he thought there was another man disclosing, "Hey, I'm really angry at you." And he knew that what that did is give them an opportunity to move through a process together, and that on the other side of that, they're going to be bonded. And so I think that that's part of our issue, is that we don't set up, like we are longing for social connection. It's necessary. And where we convene, we don't have process to help us navigate the complexity of those social structures and the inevitability of conflict. In a therapy group, we do. We set it up right out of the gate. We are going to have rupture and repair. In marriage, we work on that deeply because, oh my gosh, I mean, the connection between love and hate in a long-term intimate relationship like marriage is present. And so your commitment, you're going to learn how to forgive, how to accept, how to communicate, how to manage your emotions, how to co-regulate, how to create relationships outside that, so you're not overly dependent on one person, so on and so forth. So that goes in all these institutions, whether it's marriage or friendships or the fire department or the church or the holy space or the community in our country or in other countries. How does Congress, what's their process for rupture and repair? It has nothing, and it shouldn't have anything to do with who wins.
Mm.
So that's my prayer, is that we have more opportunities to have those structures. And I'm busy writing the one that it's a combination of a number of different approaches, but I think the most important thing is when you create a community, you actually think through how you're going to navigate conflict and dynamics that inevitably arise.
I love it. Yeah, I would love to ask you who some of the biggest inspirations have been throughout your life that have shaped your thinking more than anyone, or how you operate in the world, whether it be alive or dead, or writing, or even people that you've met.
Well, I said it earlier. I mean, my wife is by far one of the most powerful and potent creatures in my children, my family. When we answer that question, I really want to look at the sacred spaces in my own life and the people that I interact with. And so, of course, like my wife and I are, she's a physician of Chinese medicine, and I'm a Jungian depth psychologist. And so we complement and clash and come together and repair and do the dynamics, and we're each other's person. So I have a deep reverence and appreciation for how much more expansive I am in this world because she's in it. Mm-hmm. And so there's that personal dimension to it. And of course, my children are some of the greatest teachers in my life because because I love them so dearly, I'm willing to move beyond some of my adaptations to show up in ways that are novel, that are innovative. Okay, so you've named a couple so far. Richard Rohr has been, I think, one of the more important figures from a theological perspective, and kind of teaching me the intersection between theology and psychology. James Hollis, he was involved in my dissertation committee, as I've said. He's inevitably been important. Jeffrey Kripal is a dear friend and one of the more, I call them pathfinders or wayfinders. And Kripal has expanded my life because of his work. I'm in a community of a group of men that I deeply admire and respect, and we consider our work to be spiritual sparring. And I'm held accountable to these men, and I reveal myself to these men, and they reveal themselves to me. And we have levels of intimacy that are profound. And I've got a number of friend groups that are men that I feel deeply empowered by and expanded by. Of course, Carl Jung is a massive figure. I have a new devotion to Kali as a divine image, and I feel really blessed to have a feminine energy in this kind of pantheon that I connect with. But honestly, I mean, my main feeling as you say that is regret that I'm not going to say all the people that have been so instrumental in my formation. Charlene Horak is a therapist in Fort Worth. Karen Purvis is, I would consider them both incredibly important in my formation. The women that I sat around the playground with after my son got out of his early school when he was a child, and I, as this man having no idea what to do raising a child, sat around at their feet and just asked questions about bottle feeding and about nighttime rituals and about making food and organic everything. And
Hmm.
those circles were incredible. So I know that I'm leaving people out in the process, but Peter Kingsley right now is a pretty important person he wrote a book, Catafalque. I mean, just look at my podcast, and the blessing of doing this work, as I know you know, is that in a lot of ways I get to talk to the people that are influential. I just talked with a guy, Greg Shaw, that is teaching me about theurgy. I could go on and on. I mean, every single person on my podcast has transformed my life in meaningful ways. I know
I
I missed.
love it. No, it's beautiful. And I love your podcast, the way you approach your questions and the way you engage these people. It's amazing. And I'm pretty new to it. I've only probably heard about 8 of them, but I love it. And I even like your little solo cast that you're exploring and experimenting with.
Thanks.
Those
Yeah,
are
that's a
great.
fun. That's getting legs. You know, you start these things and you go, all right, how can I
Connect
I
more.
really? So that I'm putting some more form to that, and that's really the objective. It's like, what are these various vehicles that can? I'm a researcher mixed with practitioner, and so I'm deeply curious about the nature of all of this. You know, like my library is full of books that I've read. Some, of course, I haven't, and these incredible teachings. But then, as a practitioner, I say, okay, how do I take these teachings and then make them, translate them into supportive materials to address the suffering that we all experience, and that many people don't have community direction process to, they don't have the time or the interest to go read a bunch of, ancient Greek texts or, the philosophical texts. So I think that what I'm trying to build, and certainly will be building more and more over the next year, are these landscapes for people to enter into. So I was talking earlier about the PDF, which is just a real low ticket. I mean, it's $34. It's 3 weeks of daily practice. I finished writing it's a 21-page document, and I just went, whoa, that feels really good. I think I said exactly what I wanted to say.
Wow.
And then there's a monthly group I offer, as I was saying earlier. The book I'm offering, the groups, like, it's a real gift to be able to give creativity life in this way. And I thank you and for your feedback on that. That means a lot.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, you're definitely inspirational, and it's nice to connect with you. And I could talk to you for a long time, but we're at that part where I have to try to ask you one more question. Maybe we could even do it again someday, because this has been
Good.
really fun.
Totally down. This is great.
Yeah, there's like a whole list of things over here I could get to, but there's just not enough time today. So, but it's been fun. And I always ask, if you were going to die today, what would you want to say to the world?
Oh, what a great question. I would want to say thank you. I hope my last breath is gratitude. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, what a gift. Yeah. That's what I want to say.
I love it. I really appreciate connecting with you and for your time today, and we'll stay connected in the future.
Amen, man. I'm down. Thank you for doing what you're doing. I mean, on all levels. I'm really moved by the contribution to the world that you're making in your professional life, and also that you, on your off days, provide people a service to understand material and connect with material that can be pretty opaque and difficult to access. And I see you as a translator as well. And so thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor, brother.
Yeah, brother.
Thank you. All right.
Man.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.